Popular kids thought forcing the quiet girl to walk home in the rain would be just another Tuesday. They had no idea they were about to discover her secret identity, and 48 hours later, they'd be desperately trying to undo the biggest mistake of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Rodriguez had mastered the art of being invisible at Riverside Community High School. She wasn't the girl who raised her hand in class, wasn't the one posting selfies in the hallway, and definitely wasn't part of any social circle that mattered. She preferred it that way. Every morning, she'd slip through the main entrance with her worn backpack, navigate the crowded hallways like a ghost, and settle into her usual spot in the back corner of every classroom. Her teachers knew her as the student who always turned in perfect assignments, but never spoke unless directly asked. Her classmates knew her as the girl who existed somewhere in their peripheral vision, present, but not really there. What made Emma different wasn't just her quiet nature, though. While other students spent their time gossiping about weekend parties or stressing about social media likes, Emma had developed an unusual habit of watching people. She'd study the way conversations flowed, how groups formed and dissolved, and, most importantly, how power moved through the social ecosystem of Cedar Falls' most chaotic high school. She noticed things others missed, remembered details others forgot, and filed away information that would later prove invaluable. Her appearance contributed to her invisibility. Emma dressed practically, always in dark colors that helped her blend into backgrounds. Her long brown hair was usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she had a habit of adjusting her glasses when she was nervous, which was often. She carried herself with the careful posture of someone who had learned that taking up less space meant attracting less attention. To most people at Riverside, Emma Rodriguez was just another face in the crowd of 1,200 students, remarkable only in how unremarkable she seemed. Riverside Community High School sprawled across 15 acres in Cedar Falls, Oregon, a town where rain was more reliable than sunshine and everyone knew everyone else's business. The school had been built in the 1980s and looked at, with its brick facade and narrow windows that never seemed to let in enough light. Inside, the hallways were lined with faded motivational posters and trophy cases that hadn't been updated since the glory days of the 1990s basketball team. The social hierarchy was as rigid as the old heating system, with clearly defined territories and unspoken rules that everyone understood but no one acknowledged. The athletic wing belonged to the jocks, the arts corridor was claimed by theater kids and band members, and the central hallway served as neutral territory where different groups could coexist without direct confrontation. The cafeteria operated on a complex seating chart that existed only in the collective consciousness of the student body, with each table representing a different social stratum. Emma typically ate lunch in the library, where the few other social outcasts gathered to avoid the complicated dance of cafeteria politics. This carefully balanced ecosystem had its apex predators, and Tyler Brooks was undoubtedly at the top of the food chain. At 17, Tyler had already secured his position as team captain of the varsity basketball team, a role that came with automatic social authority and the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was tall, athletic, and possessed the easy charm that made teachers overlook his occasional disciplinary issues and made other students eager to be in his orbit. Tyler had grown up in Cedar Falls, the son of a successful local contractor, and he carried himself with the assurance of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. Madison Clark served as Tyler's second-in-command, though she wielded her own distinct form of power. Where Tyler's influence came from athletic prowess and natural charisma, Madison had built her reputation on social media savvy and an intuitive understanding of teenage psychology. She ran the most followed Instagram account at Riverside, documenting The lives of the popular crowd with a photographer's eye for drama and a gossip columnist's hunger for content. Madison had moved to Cedar Falls from California 2 years earlier, bringing with her a sophisticated sense of style and an outsider's perspective on small-town social dynamics that she used to her advantage. Derek Kim completed the trio, serving as both comic relief and loyal follower. Derek had earned his place in the popular crowd through his willingness to go along with whatever Tyler and Madison planned, his ability to make others laugh at his own expense and his family's wealth, which funded many of the group's activities. He was the kind of person who thrived on being included, even when that inclusion came at the cost of his own dignity or the dignity of others. Together, Tyler, Madison, and Derek formed a formidable alliance that dominated the social landscape of Riverside High. They weren't traditional bullies in the sense of physically threatening other students, but their influence was pervasive and their cruelty was sophisticated. They operated through exclusion, public humiliation, and the kind of psychological warfare that left no visible bruises, but could devastate a person's sense of self-worth. They were experts at identifying weakness and exploiting it, at finding the exact pressure points that would cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Emma had somehow managed to fly under their radar for most of her junior year, but that invisibility was about to become a liability. The trio was always hunting for new sources of entertainment, and Emma's very determination to avoid attention had begun to attract it. There was something about her deliberate anonymity that intrigued them, something about her careful neutrality that made them want to crack her composure and see what lay beneath. The first signs of trouble began in early March, when the Pacific Northwest weather had settled into its typical pattern of persistent drizzle and gray skies. Emma had been walking to her chemistry class when she noticed Tyler watching her from across the hallway. It wasn't the casual glance of someone people watching, but the focused attention of a predator sizing up potential prey. She quickly looked away and hurried to her classroom, but the feeling of being studied lingered throughout the day. The next incident occurred during lunch period, when Emma was sitting alone in the library working at her calculus homework. Madison had walked by her table twice, each time slowing down to glance at Emma's work with an expression of exaggerated curiosity. The second time, Madison had made a comment to her friend about students who ate lunch alone, loud enough for Emma to hear but quiet enough to maintain deniability. Emma had felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she'd kept her eyes on her textbook and tried to pretend she hadn't heard. By the end of the week, the pattern had become clear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tyler would catch her eye in the hallway and hold her gaze a beat too long, making her uncomfortable. Madison would make subtle comments about Emma's clothes or her antisocial behavior within earshot of other students. Derek would occasionally knock into her locker or step in front of her in the lunch line, always with an apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. These weren't random acts of teenage thoughtlessness. They were the opening moves in a carefully orchestrated campaign, designed to test Emma's boundaries and gauge her responses. Emma's strategy was to weather the storm through non-engagement. She'd learned long ago that the best way to deal with bullies was to become an uninteresting target, to react so little that they would eventually move on to someone who provided better entertainment. She'd perfected the art of the neutral expression, the non-committal response, and the strategic retreat. When Tyler stared, she would look away. When Madison made comments, she would pretend not to hear. When Derek invaded her space, she would simply move to a different location. But Emma's careful neutrality only seemed to increase their interest. The lack of reaction that had protected her from other potential tormentors was now working against her, making her appear mysterious rather than boring. Tyler began to interpret her silence as a challenge to his authority. Madison saw her restraint as evidence of hidden depth that would make for compelling social media content. Derek was simply following the lead of his friends, but he was also genuinely curious about the girl who seemed immune to their usual tactics. The situation escalated gradually, with each incident slightly more aggressive than the last. Tyler began blocking her path in the hallway, forcing her to ask him to move or find an alternate route. Madison started taking photos of Emma without permission, claiming she was documenting the authentic high school experience for her followers. Derek would make loud comments about Emma's appearance or behavior when she was within hearing distance, then act confused when she didn't respond. Emma's response was to adapt her schedule and routes to avoid confrontation. She started arriving at school earlier to avoid the morning rush, taking longer paths to her classes to avoid Tyler's usual haunts, and leaving immediately after the final bell to minimize her exposure to the trio's attention. She packed her lunch to avoid the cafeteria entirely and spent her free periods in the library, or empty classrooms where she was less likely to encounter them. This defensive strategy worked for several weeks, but it also isolated Emma further from the normal social life of the school. She was spending more time alone, speaking to fewer people, and gradually withdrawing from the few casual friendships she had maintained. The stress of constantly being on guard was exhausting, and Emma found herself losing sleep and struggling to concentrate on her studies. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late March, when the Oregon weather had decided to live up to its reputation with a sustained downpour that had been falling since dawn. Emma typically rode the bus home, a 20-minute journey that took her through downtown Cedar Falls and into the Willow Creek subdivision where she lived with her mother. The bus was crowded and loud, but it was reliable transportation that allowed her to avoid walking the 2-3 miles home through weather that could change from drizzle to deluge without warning. On this particular Tuesday, Emma had stayed after school to make up a lab assignment in chemistry class. Mrs. Chun had been patient with Emma's request for extra time, understanding that some students preferred to work when the classroom was quieter and less chaotic. Emma had spent an hour carefully completing her titration calculations and cleaning up her workspace, finally finishing just as the custodial staff was beginning their evening rounds. When Emma walked out to the bus stop, she discovered that the last bus had already departed. The digital schedule board showed that the next bus wouldn't arrive for another hour, and the rain was coming down harder than it had all day. Emma checked her phone, hoping to call her mother for a ride, but Dr. Sarah Rodriguez was in surgery and wouldn't be available for several hours. Emma's few friends lived in different parts of town, and she had always been too independent to develop the kind of relationships where she could ask for favors. Emma was standing under the inadequate shelter of the bus stop, trying to decide whether to wait for the next bus or attempt the long walk home, when Tyler, Madison, and Derek emerged from the school building. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying across the parking lot as they headed toward Tyler's car. Emma tried to make herself smaller, hoping they wouldn't notice her, but Madison's attention was immediately drawn to the lone figure at the bus stop. "Oh my God. Is that Emma Rodriguez standing in the rain like a lost puppy?" Madison's voice was loud enough to carry over the sound of the rain, and Emma felt her stomach drop as the trio changed direction and began walking toward her. Tyler reached the bus stop first, his basketball letterman jacket keeping him dry, while Emma's thin hoodie was already soaked through. "What are you doing out here, Rodriguez? Don't you have somewhere to be?" Emma looked up at him, rain dripping from her glasses, and tried to keep her voice steady. "I missed my bus. I'm waiting for the next one." Madison pulled out her phone and began recording, a habit that had become second nature to her. "This is so sad. Look at her, just standing here in the rain like she doesn't have any friends to give her a ride." Derek joined in, his voice taking on a mock concerned tone. "Emma, you know you could just ask someone for help, right? I mean, if you actually talk to people instead of being all weird and antisocial." Emma felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm fine." The next bus will be here soon. Tyler laughed, but there was no humor in it. The next bus isn't for an hour, Rodriguez. You're going to stand here getting soaked for an hour, rather than admit you need help? That's pretty pathetic. Madison continued recording, her phone capturing Emma's discomfort from multiple angles. This is going to make such good content. The antisocial girl who's too proud to ask for help. My followers are going to eat this up. Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she kept her voice level. I don't need help, I can walk home. The three exchanged glances, and Emma realized she had made a mistake. She had given them exactly what they wanted, a reaction that showed she was rattled, and a plan that would make her even more vulnerable. Tyler's smile was predatory. You're going to walk home in this weather? That's gotta be what, 3 miles? Through downtown and then up those hills to Willow Creek. In this rain? Madison lowered her phone for a moment, her expression shifting to something that might have been genuine concern if Emma hadn't known better. Emma, that's actually dangerous. The streets flood when it rains this hard. You could get hurt. Derek nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, and there's that sketchy area near the bridge. You really shouldn't walk through there alone. Emma knew they were right about the dangers, but she also knew that accepting help from them would only make her situation worse. She had seen how they treated other students who had become dependent on their charity. I'll be fine. Tyler shrugged, his expression innocent. Well, if you're sure. I mean, we were going to offer you a ride, but if you prefer to walk. Emma's internal alarm bells were screaming. She knew that getting in a car with Tyler, Madison, and Derek would be a mistake that would haunt her for the rest of her high school career. Whatever they had planned, it would be worse than a long walk in the rain. I appreciate the offer, but I'll walk. Madison raised her phone again, this time switching to live streaming mode. You guys, you have to see this. Emma Rodriguez is literally choosing to walk home in a thunderstorm rather than accept a ride from us. I can't even. Tyler leaned against the bus stop shelter, clearly enjoying the show. Rodriguez, you know what this looks like, right? It looks like you think you're too good for us. Like you're better than everyone else. Emma felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. For months, she had endured their subtle harassment, their constant testing, their attempts to crack her composure. She had remained silent, neutral, invisible. But standing there in the rain, soaked to the skin and facing a dangerous walk home, something inside her snapped. I don't think I'm better than anyone, she said, her voice carrying more strength than she had intended. I just know better than to get in a car with people who have spent months trying to make my life miserable. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain hitting the pavement. Tyler's expression darkened. Madison's phone camera captured every moment, and Derek looked genuinely shocked by Emma's directness. Tyler stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than shouting. Excuse me? Are you calling us bullies? Emma looked up at him, rain still streaming down her glasses, and made a decision that would change everything, if the shoe fits. Madison's gasp was audible over the rain. Oh my God, did you just hear that? She basically just called us bullies on my live stream. This is insane. Tyler's jaw clenched, and Emma could see that she had crossed a line she hadn't even known existed. You know what, Rodriguez? You want to walk home in the rain? Go ahead. But don't expect any sympathy when you show up to school tomorrow looking like a drowned rat. Derek laughed nervously. Maybe she'll get pneumonia and we won't have to deal with her attitude anymore. Madison was still recording, her commentary becoming more animated as she sensed the escalating drama. This is literally the most exciting thing that's happened all semester. Emma Rodriguez just showed her true colors, and they are not pretty. Emma picked up her backpack, which had been sitting in a growing puddle at her feet, and squared her shoulders. I'd rather walk home in a storm than spend 5 minutes in a car with you three. Tyler's voice followed her as she began walking toward the street. Have fun with your little adventure, Rodriguez. Hope it's worth it. Madison's live stream. Commentary continued as Emma walked away. And there she goes, ladies and gentlemen. The antisocial girl who thinks she's too good for everyone else. Let's see how far that attitude gets her. Emma didn't look back as she left the school parking lot and began the long journey home. The rain was coming down harder now, and she could already feel water seeping through her sneakers. Her backpack was getting heavier with each step as it absorbed more water, and her glasses were so fogged and rain-spotted that she could barely see where she was going. The first mile took her through the commercial district of Cedar Falls, past the coffee shops and boutiques that catered to the town's growing population of young professionals. The sidewalks were relatively well maintained here, and there were enough streetlights and storefront windows to provide some visibility. Emma walked quickly, her head down against the rain, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. As she walked, Emma's mind raced through the confrontation she had just experienced. She had finally stood up to Tyler, Madison, and Derek, but she knew that her victory would be short-lived. Madison's live stream had probably been watched by dozens of students, and by tomorrow morning, everyone at Riverside would know about Emma's refusal to accept help and her accusation of bullying. She would be labeled as ungrateful, antisocial, and worst of all, a snitch. The second mile took Emma through the older residential neighborhoods, where the houses were smaller and the streetlights were farther apart. The rain had turned the fallen leaves into a slippery mess, and Emma had to walk carefully to avoid slipping on the wet pavement. Her clothes were completely soaked through by now, and she could feel the cold seeping into her bones. Her phone was getting wet despite being in her pocket, and she worried that it might stop working before she made it home. Emma's thoughts turned to her mother, Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, who was probably still in surgery at Cedar Falls General Hospital. Sarah had worked incredibly hard to build her career as a trauma surgeon, often putting in 16-hour days to establish her reputation in a field dominated by men. Emma was proud of her mother's success, but she also understood the sacrifices that success required. Sarah had moved them to Cedar Falls 2 years ago when she had been offered a position at the hospital, and Emma had adapted to the new town and new school without complaint. What Emma had never told her mother was how difficult the transition had been. Moving to a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business had made Emma's natural introversion even more pronounced. She had learned to be invisible as a survival mechanism to avoid the kind of attention that led to uncomfortable questions about her family, her background, and her plans for the future. Emma had secrets that she wasn't ready to share, talents that she wasn't ready to reveal, and a past that she wasn't ready to explain. The third mile was the most challenging, taking Emma through the area that Derek had mentioned as sketchy. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous in the traditional sense, but it was poorly lit and sparsely populated, with empty lots and abandoned buildings that provided plenty of places for someone to hide. Emma walked faster here, her wet sneakers squelching. With each step, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. As Emma climbed the hill toward the Willow Creek subdivision, she allowed herself to think about what would happen next. Madison's live stream had probably ended by now, but the video would be saved and shared. By tomorrow morning, Emma's confrontation with the trio would be dissected and analyzed by every student at Riverside. She would be the girl who was too proud to accept help, the antisocial weirdo who accused popular kids of bullying, the drama queen who preferred to walk home in a storm rather than admit she needed assistance. But as Emma finally turned onto her street and saw the lights of her house in the distance, she realized that she didn't regret her decision. For the first time in months, she had stood up for herself. She had spoken her truth, even though she knew it would cost her. She had chosen dignity over convenience, principle over popularity. And as she walked up the driveway to her house, soaked to the skin but with her head held high, Emma Rodriguez began to understand that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight alone. Emma Rodriguez stood in her bedroom the next morning, staring at her reflection in the mirror, as she prepared for what she knew would be one of the most difficult days of her high school career. Her clothes from the previous evening hung over her desk chair, still damp despite spending the night near the heating vent. Her sneakers sat by the door, stuffed with newspaper to help them dry out, looking like casualties from a battle she wasn't sure she had won. The walk home had taken her nearly 2 hours, and by the time she had reached her front door, Emma was shivering uncontrollably, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint that concerned her mother when Dr. Rodriguez arrived home from the hospital. Sarah had immediately drawn a hot bath, made Emma drink warm tea, and spent the evening checking her daughter for signs of hypothermia while listening to Emma's carefully edited version of events. Emma had explained the missed bus and the long walk, but had omitted the confrontation with Tyler, Madison, and Derek. She wasn't ready to involve her mother in the social politics of Riverside High, and she certainly wasn't prepared to explain why she had chosen a dangerous walk over accepting help from classmates. But as Emma got dressed for school, choosing her clothes with more care than usual, she found herself thinking about the moment when she had finally spoken up. For months, she had practiced strategic silence, believing that invisibility would protect her from the kind of harassment that destroyed other students' high school experiences. She had watched Tyler, Madison, and Derek systematically target various classmates, always finding new victims when the old ones either graduated or transferred to other schools. Emma had convinced herself that if she could just remain uninteresting enough, she would survive her remaining time at Riverside without becoming their next entertainment project. Yesterday's confrontation had shattered that illusion. Emma now understood that her attempts at invisibility had only delayed the inevitable, and that Tyler, Madison, and Derek had been studying her just as carefully as she had been studying them. They had identified her isolation as a vulnerability rather than a strength, her independence as pride rather than practicality, and her silence as a challenge rather than submission. The confrontation at the bus stop had been orchestrated to force Emma into a no-win situation where she would be humiliated regardless of her choice. Emma's phone buzzed with notifications throughout the morning as she got ready for school. Madison's live stream from the previous evening had been viewed hundreds of times overnight, and Emma could see that it had been shared across multiple social media platforms. Students from Riverside were commenting on the video, dissecting Emma's behavior and speculating about her motivations. Some comments were supportive, praising Emma for standing up to bullies, but many others were critical, calling her ungrateful, antisocial, and attention-seeking. The most painful comments came from students Emma had considered neutral parties, classmates who had never shown her any hostility, but who now felt qualified to judge her actions based on a few minutes of edited video. Emma read comments questioning her mental health, her family situation, and her fitness to attend Riverside High. She saw herself described as weird, stuck-up, and potentially dangerous. The narrative that was emerging painted Emma as an unstable outsider who had finally revealed her true colors by attacking popular students who had tried to help her. Emma turned off her phone and finished getting ready in silence. She had expected social media backlash, but seeing her character assassinated in real time was more painful than she had anticipated. She reminded herself that online comments from teenagers were not reliable indicators of truth or reality, but the emotional impact was undeniable. She was about to walk into a school where hundreds of students had watched her humiliation and formed opinions about her character based on incomplete information. Dr. Rodriguez was waiting in the kitchen when Emma came downstairs, her surgical scrubs replaced by casual clothes that indicated she had taken the morning off from the hospital. Sarah studied her daughter's face with the careful attention of someone trained to spot signs of distress in people who were trying to hide their pain. "Emma, are you sure you're feeling well enough for school today? You were pretty chilled last night, and I want to make sure you don't have any lingering effects from being out in that storm." Emma appreciated her mother's concern, but she also recognized the offer as an escape route that she couldn't afford to take. Missing school would only confirm the narrative that she was unstable and unable to handle normal social situations. It would also give Tyler, Madison, and Derek another day to control the story without any input from her. "I'm fine, Mom. It was just rain." Sarah's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but she had learned over the years to trust Emma's judgment about her own capabilities. "All right, but I want you to text me if you start feeling sick or if anything unusual happens at school. And Emma, I know you like to handle things on your own, but you can always call me if you need anything." Emma kissed her mother goodbye and walked out to catch the bus, her stomach churning with anxiety about the day ahead. The bus ride too. School was usually a time when Emma could collect her thoughts and prepare for the academic day. But this morning she found herself hyper-aware of every whispered conversation and sideways glance from other students. She couldn't tell if people were actually talking about her or if her paranoia was making her imagine hostile attention where none existed. When the bus pulled up to Riverside High, Emma took a deep breath and prepared herself for the gauntlet of walking through the main hallway to her locker. The morning rush was always chaotic, with students reuniting after a night apart, discussing homework assignments, and planning their social activities for the day. Emma typically navigated this crowd like water flowing around rocks, finding the path of least resistance and avoiding any interactions that might slow her progress. Today was different. As Emma walked through the main entrance, she immediately noticed that conversations were stopping as she passed. Students who had never paid attention to her before were now watching her with undisguised curiosity. Some were openly holding up their phones, apparently recording her entrance for their own social media content. Emma felt like an exhibit in a zoo, a specimen being observed and analyzed by people who had never bothered to see her as a human being. Tyler, Madison, and Derek were waiting by the trophy case, positioned strategically so that Emma would have to walk past them to reach her locker. They were surrounded by their usual crowd of admirers and hangers-on, but today the group seemed larger and more animated than usual. Emma could see Madison holding court, probably retelling the story of the previous evening with dramatic embellishments. That cast Emma as an even more unreasonable character. Emma considered taking an alternate route to her locker, but she realized that any deviation from her normal routine would be interpreted as evidence that she was ashamed of her behavior or afraid to face the consequences of her actions. She kept walking straight ahead, her eyes focused on her destination, her expression carefully neutral. As she approached the group, Madison's voice rose loud enough to ensure that Emma and everyone else in the vicinity could hear every word. And then she said, "If the shoe fits," like she was in some kind of movie. I mean, who talks like that? It was so dramatic and pathetic. We were literally trying to help her, and she acted like we were criminals or something. Tyler nodded sympathetically, playing his role as the misunderstood victim. I felt bad for her, honestly. Like, how paranoid do you have to be to think that people offering you a ride are trying to hurt you? It says a lot about her mental state. Derek chimed in with his characteristic lack of subtlety. My mom always says that people who think everyone is out to get them usually have good reason to think that. Like, maybe Emma has done something that makes her think she deserves to be treated badly. Emma walked past the group without acknowledging their performance, but she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes following her progress down the hallway. She could hear whispered conversations picking up in her wake, and she knew that the story of her confrontation with Tyler, Madison, and Derek was being analyzed and dissected by students who had never spoken to her before, but now felt qualified to judge her character and motivations. At her locker, Emma focused on the mechanical task of retrieving her books and organizing her materials for the morning's classes. She had learned long ago that routine activities could provide a sense of control and normalcy, even in chaotic situations. As she sorted through her textbooks, Emma allowed herself to think about the choices that had led her to this moment. Moving to Cedar Falls had been presented as a fresh start, an opportunity for Emma and her mother to build a new life in a place where Sarah's medical expertise would be valued and where Emma could finish high school without the complications that had marked her earlier academic career. Sarah had been recruited by Cedar Falls General Hospital specifically for her skills as a trauma surgeon, and the position had offered both professional advancement and geographical distance from the problems they had left behind. Emma had supported the move, understanding that her mother's career opportunities were limited in their previous location and that a change of scenery might benefit both of them. She had researched Riverside High School online, familiarizing herself with the academic programs and extracurricular activities that would be available to her. She had looked forward to the anonymity that came with being a new student in a large school, believing that she could reinvent herself as someone ordinary and unremarkable. What Emma hadn't anticipated was how difficult it would be to maintain her carefully constructed facade in a small town where everyone was connected and privacy was a luxury few people enjoyed. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where residents knew their neighbor's business, where high school social dynamics influenced adult relationships, and where reputation was both fragile and enduring. Emma's attempts to remain invisible had been noticed precisely because they were so successful, and her refusal to engage with the social hierarchy had been interpreted as arrogance rather than self-preservation. Emma's first class of the day was Advanced Placement Chemistry with Mrs. Chun, a teacher who had always treated Emma with professional respect and academic encouragement. Mrs. Chun was one of the few adults at Riverside who seemed to recognize Emma's intellectual capabilities and who had never pushed her to be more social or outgoing. Chemistry class had become a refuge for Emma, a place where her careful attention to detail and methodical approach to problem solving were valued rather than seen as antisocial quirks. But even Mrs. Chun's classroom couldn't protect Emma from the social fallout of the previous evening's confrontation. As students filed into class, Emma could feel their stares and hear their whispered comments. Several students pulled out their phones and appeared to be showing videos to their classmates, and Emma realized that Madison's live stream was being shared and reshared throughout the school. Emma took her usual seat at the lab bench in the back corner of the room, hoping that the morning's lesson would provide enough of a distraction to get her through the class period without incident. Mrs. Chun began explaining the day's experiment, a complex titration that would require students to work in pairs and carefully monitor their chemical reactions. Emma typically enjoyed lab work, finding satisfaction in the precision and predictability of chemical processes. But when Mrs. Chun began assigning lab partners, Emma realized that her social isolation was about to become a practical problem. Students quickly paired off with their friends, leaving Emma as the only person without a partner. In previous classes, Mrs. Chun had either allowed Emma to work alone or had assigned her to work with another unpaired student. Today, however, the teacher seemed determined to integrate Emma into the social fabric of the classroom. "Emma, you can work with Jessica and Aiden. They can accommodate a third person for today's experiment." Jessica Monroe and Aiden Foster were solidly middle-tier students, neither popular nor outcasts, who typically kept to themselves and focused on their academic work. Emma had never had any conflict with either of them, but she also had never attempted to build any kind of relationship beyond polite classroom interactions. As Emma gathered her materials and moved to their lab bench, she could see the discomfort in their expressions. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice carefully neutral. "So, I guess we saw Madison's video last night. That looked pretty intense." Emma felt her face flush with embarrassment, but she kept her voice steady. "It wasn't as dramatic as it probably looked online." Aiden adjusted his safety goggles and began setting up the titration equipment. Tyler and those guys can be pretty overwhelming. I probably would have taken the ride, but I get why you didn't want to. Emma was surprised by Aiden's matter-of-fact tone and his apparent understanding of her situation. She had expected judgment or uncomfortable questions, not this casual acceptance of her choices. Jessica added, Madison's live streams are always pretty biased anyway. She makes everything look more dramatic than it actually is, because that's what gets views. As they began working on their experiment, Emma found herself relaxing slightly. Jessica and Aiden weren't treating her like a social pariah or a fascinating specimen to be studied. They were treating her like a classmate who had been in an uncomfortable situation, and their casual acceptance of her behavior was more comforting than Emma had expected. But Emma's relief was short-lived. Halfway through the class period, Tyler Brooks walked into the chemistry classroom with a late pass from the nurse's office. Emma's stomach dropped as she realized that Tyler was also enrolled in advanced placement chemistry, a fact she had somehow forgotten in her anxiety about the morning's social challenges. Tyler took his seat at a lab bench near the front of the funga room, but Emma could feel his presence like a physical weight. She tried to focus on her titration calculations, but she found herself glancing up periodically to see if Tyler was watching her. Each time she looked, Tyler seemed to be engaged in his own experiment, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he was hyper-aware of her presence in the classroom. Mrs. Chen was circulating around the room, checking on students' progress and offering guidance when their experiments weren't proceeding as expected. When she reached Emma's lab bench, she paused to examine their data and nodded approvingly. Excellent work, all three of you. Your measurements are very precise, and your calculations are spot on. Emma, your attention to detail is really showing in these results. Emma felt a flush of pride at Mrs. Chen's praise, but she also noticed Tyler looking in her direction when the teacher complimented her work. Emma had always been careful to keep her academic achievements low profile, understanding that intellectual success could be just as socially isolating as academic failure. In the complex ecosystem of high school social dynamics. As the class period neared its end, Mrs. Chen began moving around the room again, this time to collect the completed lab reports. When she reached Tyler's bench, Emma heard her voice take on a tone of concern. Tyler, where is your lab report? You and Marcus should have finished this experiment 20 minutes ago. Tyler's response was loud enough for the entire class to hear. Sorry, Mrs. Chen. Marcus and I were having trouble with our calculations. I guess we're not all naturally brilliant, like some people in this class. Emma felt every student in the room turned to look at her, and she realized that Tyler's comment was a deliberate attempt to paint her academic success as arrogance or showing off. She kept her eyes focused on her lab report, but she could feel the familiar sensation of being studied and judged by people who had never bothered to understand her motivations or capabilities. Mrs. Chen's voice was firm as she responded to Tyler's implied criticism. Tyler, academic success is the result of hard work and attention to detail, not natural brilliance. If you and Marcus were having trouble with your calculations, you should have asked for help rather than waiting until the end of class to mention the problem. Tyler's expression suggested that he wasn't pleased with Mrs. Chen's response, but he couldn't argue with a teacher without risking disciplinary consequences. He gathered his materials with slightly more force than necessary, and Emma could see that his frustration was building rather than dissipating. As students began packing up their materials and preparing for the transition to their next classes, Emma felt a familiar sense of dread about leaving the relative safety of Mrs. Jian's classroom. The chemistry lab had provided a temporary respite from the social pressure that was building around her, but she knew that the rest of her day would bring new challenges and uncomfortable encounters. Jessica and Aiden helped Emma clean up their lab station, and as they worked together to put away equipment and dispose of chemical waste, Jessica spoke quietly. Emma, I don't know if this helps, but most people are going to forget about this whole thing in a few days. Drama at Riverside never lasts very long because there's always something new happening. Emma appreciated Jessica's attempt to be reassuring, but she also understood that this situation was different from typical high school drama. Tyler, Madison, and Derek had made her refusal to accept their help into a public story about her character and mental state. They had framed her independence as ingratitude and her caution as paranoia, and Emma knew that these narratives had a way of becoming accepted truth if they weren't challenged. As Emma gathered her books and prepared to leave the chemistry classroom, she made a decision that would change everything. She was tired of being defensive, tired of trying to explain herself to people who had already made up their minds about her character, and tired of allowing other people to control the narrative about her life. Emma Rodriguez had spent 2 years in Cedar Falls carefully constructing an identity as an unremarkable student who wanted nothing more than to complete her education without drama or complications. She had hidden her talents, minimized her achievements, and avoided any situation that might draw attention to her capabilities or her background. She had convinced herself that invisibility was a form of protection, that anonymity was safer than authenticity. But as Emma walked out of Mrs. Chun's classroom and into the crowded hallway of Riverside High School, she realized that her strategy of hiding had only made her more vulnerable to attack. Tyler, Madison, and Derek had sensed her fear of exposure and had used it against her, correctly calculating that she would rather endure their harassment than risk having her secrets revealed. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. "Hope your day is going well. Remember that you can call me if you need anything. Love you." Emma stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about everything her mother had sacrificed to build a new life in Cedar Falls. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez had left behind a successful medical practice, longtime friendships, and professional relationships to accept a position at Cedar Falls General Hospital. She had uprooted her daughter's life, enrolled her in a new school, and trusted Emma to adapt to their new circumstances without compromising her academic or personal goals. Emma had never told her mother about the real reasons they had needed to leave their previous home, and she had never explained why anonymity and invisibility had become such important survival strategies. Sarah knew some of Emma's history, but she didn't know everything, and Emma had worked hard to keep certain aspects of her past buried. But standing in the hallway of Riverside High School, surrounded by students who thought they knew her story based on a few minutes of social media drama, Emma began to understand that secrets had their own kind of power. Information that was hidden could be used as a weapon, but information that was revealed strategically could be used as a shield. Emma made her way to her next class, her mind racing with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. For 2 years, she had been playing defense, trying to protect herself from discovery and judgment. But Emma Rodriguez had resources that Tyler, Madison, and Derek knew nothing about, and she had been underestimating her own power for far too long. The quiet girl who had walked home in the rain was about to become someone entirely different, and Riverside High School was not prepared for the transformation that was coming. Emma's transformation began during lunch period in the most unlikely of places, the school library's computer lab. While most students gathered in the cafeteria to dissect the latest social media drama and plan their afternoon activities, Emma sat alone at a terminal in the back corner, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of fluid precision that comes from years of practice. To any casual observer, she appeared to be working on homework or researching a class project. In reality, Emma Rodriguez was about to unleash capabilities that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics at Riverside High School. The decision to act had crystallized during her walk from chemistry class to American history, when Emma overheard a conversation between 2 sophomore girls that made her blood run cold. They were discussing Madison's live stream from the previous evening, but their focus wasn't on the confrontation at the bus stop. Instead, they were speculating about Emma's family situation, wondering why a student would choose to walk home in dangerous weather rather than accept help from classmates. "My mom works at the hospital," one girl was saying, "and she thinks Emma's mom might be having financial problems. Like maybe they can't afford a car or something," and Emma was too embarrassed to admit it. The other girl nodded knowingly. That would explain why she always wears the same clothes and why she's so weird about socializing. Poor people are always paranoid that everyone's judging them. Emma had continued walking, her expression unchanged, but inside she felt a familiar surge of protective anger. These students knew nothing about her mother's career, her family's financial situation, or the sacrifices Dr. Sarah Rodriguez had made to build her medical practice. They were constructing elaborate theories based on incomplete information, filling in gaps with assumptions that revealed more about their own prejudices than about Emma's reality. But what troubled Emma most was the realization that these false narratives would spread and evolve, becoming accepted truth through repetition rather than verification. By tomorrow, half the school would know that Emma's family was struggling financially. By next week, students would be sharing stories about Emma's imaginary poverty as if they were established facts. The lie would become more compelling than the truth because it fit neatly into the story that Tyler Madison and Derek had constructed about Emma's character and motivations. Emma had spent 2 years watching this same process destroy other students' reputations and social standing. She had seen how quickly rumors became reality in the closed ecosystem of high school social dynamics, and how difficult it was to correct false narratives once they gained momentum. She had always told herself that remaining invisible would protect her from this kind of character assassination. But yesterday's confrontation had made her a target regardless of her attempts to avoid attention. Sitting at the computer terminal, Emma opened a new browser window and began accessing resources that she had kept carefully hidden from her classmates and teachers. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with muscle memory built through countless hours of practice, navigating through security protocols and authentication systems that would have challenged most adult professionals. Emma's online presence at Riverside High School consisted of the basic student portal and a rarely used social media account that contained no personal information. But Emma Rodriguez had other digital identities, other capabilities, and other connections that she had never allowed to intersect with her high school life. The first system Emma accessed was the Cedar Falls Municipal Network, a comprehensive database that contained public records, property information, and demographic data for every resident of the city. Emma's clearance level, granted through her work with a regional technology initiative, allowed her to access information that was technically public, but practically invisible to most citizens. Within minutes, Emma had compiled detailed profiles of Tyler Brooks, Madison Clark, and Derek Kim that revealed information they had never intended to share publicly. Tyler's family owned significantly more property than most Cedar Falls residents realized, including several rental units that generated substantial passive income. His father's contracting business had received multiple citations for safety violations and had been involved in a lawsuit with the city over substandard work on a municipal project. Tyler himself had been cited for reckless driving twice in the past year, incidents that had been quietly resolved through his family's connections rather than resulting in license suspension. Madison's family had moved to Cedar Falls to escape financial difficulties in California, not to pursue better opportunities, as Madison had implied in her social media presence. Her father had declared bankruptcy 18 months before their move, and the family was currently renting their house rather than owning it, as Madison frequently suggested. Madison's expensive clothes and accessories were mostly counterfeit items purchased online, a fact that Emma confirmed through image analysis and reverse searching of Madison's social media posts. Derek's family wealth was real, but it came with complications that Derek had never shared with his classmates. His parents were currently separated and involved in contentious Divorce proceedings that had been sealed by the court, but were still accessible to Emma through her research capabilities. Derek's college fund had been frozen pending the resolution of the divorce, and his family's financial future was far less secure than his current lifestyle suggested. Emma compiled this information methodically, organizing it into comprehensive files that revealed the gaps between her tormentors' public personas and their private realities. She wasn't interested in using these details for petty revenge or social media drama. Instead, Emma was building a foundation for something far more sophisticated and effective than anything Tyler, Madison, and Derek could have anticipated. Second system Emma accessed was the Riverside High School Student Information Database. Using credentials she had obtained through her volunteer work with the district's Technology Improvement Initiative, Emma had been recruited for this project by the school's IT administrator, who had noticed her exceptional technical skills during a computer science class. The volunteer position had given Emma access to system administration tools and student records that she had never abused, understanding that her access was based on trust and professional responsibility. But today, Emma's research served a different purpose. She was documenting the academic and disciplinary records of students who had been targets of Tyler, Madison, and Derek's harassment campaigns. Emma had always been observant, but now she had the tools to verify her observations with concrete data. She discovered patterns of declining academic performance, increased absences, and disciplinary incidents that correlated directly with periods when students had been targeted by the trio's social media campaigns. Emma found evidence of at least 12 students whose high school experiences had been significantly damaged by Tyler, Madison, and Derek's systematic harassment. Some had transferred to other schools, others had dropped out entirely, and several had required counseling or medical intervention to address the psychological effects of sustained bullying. In each case, the harassment had been subtle enough to avoid official disciplinary action, but persistent enough to create lasting damage. Emma's documentation revealed a clear pattern of behavior that constituted systematic harassment under both school policy and state law. Tyler, Madison, and Derek had been operating with impunity because their victims had been isolated, and their methods had been sophisticated enough to avoid detection by school administrators. But Emma now had evidence of their systematic campaign, documentation that could support formal complaints and legal action if necessary. The third system Emma accessed required significantly more sophisticated technical skills and carried considerably more risk. Using secure protocols that she had learned through her involvement with a regional cybersecurity initiative, Emma connected to the social media analytics platforms that track the reach and impact of viral content. Madison's live stream from the previous evening had been shared and viewed thousands of times, but Emma discovered that much of this engagement had been artificially amplified through bot networks and fake accounts. Emma traced the digital fingerprints of the artificial engagement back to their sources, discovering that Tyler, Madison, and Derek had been using purchased followers and engagement services to inflate their social media influence for months. Their apparent popularity was partially manufactured, their viral content was systematically promoted through paid services, and their online personas were carefully constructed marketing campaigns, rather than authentic expressions of their personalities. Emma documented these artificial engagement patterns with the kind of technical precision that would satisfy legal standards of evidence. She captured screenshots, preserved metadata, and created comprehensive analyses that revealed the extent to which Tyler, Madison, and Derek had been manipulating their online presence. This information would be devastating if it became public, but Emma had no intention of using it for simple embarrassment or social media revenge. Instead, Emma was building a comprehensive case that demonstrated systematic harassment, artificial social media manipulation, and deliberate character assassination. She was creating a portfolio of evidence that could support formal complaints with school administrators, reports to law enforcement agencies, and if necessary, civil litigation for defamation and harassment. But Emma's most significant discovery came when she accessed the Regional Trauma Response Database through her mother's medical credentials, which Sarah had shared with Emma for a research project on public health policy. Emma had legitimate access to this system for academic purposes, but today she was using it to research the psychological and social effects of systematic bullying on adolescent development. Emma discovered that Cedar Falls General Hospital had treated an unusually high number of teenagers for anxiety, depression, and self-harm incidents over the past 2 years. The medical records were confidential, but the demographic data revealed patterns that suggested a significant mental health crisis among local high school students. Emma cross-referenced these patterns with the social media activity and disciplinary records she had already compiled, discovering correlations that painted a disturbing picture of the actual impact of systematic harassment campaigns. Emma realized that Tyler Madison and Derek's behavior wasn't just typical teenage cruelty or harmless social media drama. Their systematic targeting of vulnerable students had contributed to a pattern of psychological damage that required medical intervention. Emma had evidence that their harassment campaigns had real-world consequences that extended far beyond social embarrassment or temporary discomfort. Armed with this comprehensive documentation, Emma began the second phase of her counterattack. She opened a new document and began drafting a formal complaint that would be submitted simultaneously to Riverside High School administration, the Cedar Falls Police Department, and the Oregon Department of Education. Emma's complaint wasn't an emotional response to personal harassment. It was a methodical presentation of evidence that demonstrated systematic violations of school policy, state anti-bullying laws, and federal regulations regarding the creation of hostile educational environments. Emma's writing was precise, professional, and devastating in its thoroughness. She presented her evidence in the format used by legal professionals, with numbered paragraphs, supporting documentation, and clear connections between specific incidents and broader patterns of behavior. Emma didn't position herself as the primary victim. Instead, she presented herself as a witness to systematic harassment that had affected numerous students over an extended period of time. The complaint included detailed timelines of harassment incidents, analysis of social media manipulation campaigns, documentation of academic and psychological impacts on targeted students, and evidence of administrative failures to address reported incidents. Emma supported every claim with verifiable evidence, creating a document that would be impossible to dismiss as teenage drama or personal vendetta. But Emma's counterattack extended beyond formal complaints and official channels. She had also been using her technical skills to create a comprehensive digital archive of Tyler, Madison, and Derek's online behavior, preserving evidence that they might attempt to delete or modify once they realized they were under investigation. Emma had captured thousands of social media posts, comments, private messages, and live streams that documented their systematic harassment campaigns over the past 2 years. Emma's archive included not just the content of their posts, but also metadata that revealed when content had been modified, who had shared it, and how it had been promoted through artificial engagement services. Emma had created a digital forensics portfolio that would satisfy legal standards of evidence and could support criminal charges if prosecutors determined that Tyler, Madison, and Derek's behavior constituted cyberbullying or criminal harassment. As Emma worked, she felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. For 2 years, she had carried the weight of secrets and hidden capabilities, constantly monitoring herself to ensure that she didn't reveal more than was safe or appropriate. She had lived in constant fear of discovery, believing that her technical skills and unusual background would make her a target for harassment or unwanted attention. But now Emma understood that her skills weren't vulnerabilities to be hidden. They were tools that could be used to protect herself and other students from systematic harassment. Emma had spent so much time trying to appear normal and unremarkable that she had forgotten how powerful knowledge could be when it was applied strategically and ethically. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. "How is your day going? Still worried about you after last night." Emma looked at the message and realized that her mother had been carrying her own burden of worry, concerned about Emma's social adjustment and academic success in Cedar Falls. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez had made enormous sacrifices to build a new life for her family, and Emma had been so focused on her own challenges that she hadn't fully appreciated the pressure her mother was experiencing. Emma typed back, "Day is going better than expected. Looking forward to talking with you tonight." For the first time in months, Emma's response to her mother was completely honest. Her day was going better than expected, not because her social situation had improved, but because she had finally stopped trying to manage other people's perceptions and had started focusing on her own capabilities and resources. Emma saved her work and began the process of submitting her formal complaints through the appropriate channels. She uploaded her documentation to secure servers, sent encrypted copies to multiple recipients, and created backup files that would preserve her evidence even if the primary systems were compromised. Emma had learned through her technical training that information security was as important as information gathering, and she was ensuring that her evidence would remain accessible regardless of any attempts to suppress or destroy it. As Emma prepared to leave the computer lab, she felt her phone vibrating with multiple notifications. Madison had apparently posted new content related to Emma's situation, and students were sharing and commenting on the latest developments in what they perceived as ongoing drama between Emma and the popular crowd. Emma glanced at her phone but didn't open the notifications. She was no longer interested in monitoring other people's perceptions or trying to control narratives that were based on incomplete information. Emma had evidence, resources, and capabilities that Tyler, Madison, and Derek knew nothing about, and she was about to demonstrate that systematic harassment campaigns could have consequences that extended far beyond high school social dynamics. Emma Rodriguez walked out of the computer lab with her head held high, her backpack containing printed copies of her formal complaints, and her phone containing contact information for the journalists, legal professionals, and educational advocates who would be very interested in the story she was about to tell. The quiet girl who had been forced to walk home in the rain was about to become the most powerful person at Riverside High School, and Tyler, Madison, and Derek were about to discover that they had seriously underestimated their target. Emma's counterattack was just beginning, and by tomorrow morning, everyone at Riverside High School would know exactly who Emma Rodriguez really was. The transformation of Riverside High School began at precisely 7:42 a.m. on Thursday morning, when Principal Anderson received 3 simultaneous phone calls that would fundamentally alter everything he thought he knew about his school's social dynamics. The first call came from Detective Maria Santos of the Cedar Falls Police Department, informing him that the school was now part of an active investigation into cyberbullying and criminal harassment. The second call came from Dr. Jennifer Walsh of the Oregon Department of Education, notifying him that federal compliance officers would be arriving to investigate allegations of systematic discrimination and hostile educational environments. The third call came from Sarah Rodriguez, requesting an emergency meeting to discuss her daughter's detailed documentation of ongoing harassment campaigns that had been affecting students for over 2 years. Principal Anderson had been expecting a typical Thursday morning filled with routine administrative tasks, budget meetings, and the usual collection of minor disciplinary issues that define daily life at a mid-sized public high school. Instead, he found himself at the center of a crisis that had apparently been building beneath the surface of his school's carefully maintained reputation for academic excellence and positive school culture. As he hung up from the final phone call, Anderson realized that Emma Rodriguez, the quiet junior he barely remembered meeting, had single-handedly exposed systemic problems that had escaped his attention despite his 15 years of educational Administration experience. The documentation that Emma had compiled overnight was unlike anything Anderson had seen in his professional career. Her formal complaint read like a legal brief prepared by experienced attorneys, complete with numbered exhibits, cross-referenced evidence, and comprehensive analysis that demonstrated patterns of behavior spanning multiple academic years. Emma had documented not just her own experience with Tyler Brooks, Madison Clark, and Derek Kim, but had uncovered a sophisticated harassment network that had systematically targeted vulnerable students, while avoiding detection by school administrators. Anderson's first instinct was to question the authenticity of Emma's documentation, assuming that no 17-year-old student could have produced such comprehensive and professional analysis without significant adult assistance. But when he called Dr. Rodriguez to verify the information, Sarah had calmly explained that Emma's technical and analytical capabilities were well documented through her volunteer work with multiple professional organizations, her participation in advanced cybersecurity training programs, and her collaboration with regional technology initiatives that typically recruited college graduates and experienced professionals. Emma Rodriguez, Anderson learned, was not the unremarkable student he had assumed her to be. She was a nationally recognized expert in digital forensics who had been invited to present her research at academic conferences. She held advanced certifications in cybersecurity that qualified her for professional positions with federal law enforcement agencies. She had been recruited by multiple universities for their computer science and digital journalism programs, with full scholarships that reflected her exceptional capabilities in technology and investigation. The revelation of Emma's true identity sent shockwaves through the school's administrative team as they realized that their quiet, invisible student had been documenting their institutional failures with the precision of a trained investigator. Emma's evidence revealed not just individual incidents of harassment, but systemic patterns that demonstrated the school's inadequate response to reports of bullying, discrimination, and psychological abuse. Emma's analysis showed that Tyler, Madison, and Derek had been operating a sophisticated harassment campaign that utilized social media manipulation, artificial engagement amplification, and coordinated targeting of students who lacked the social or economic resources to defend themselves effectively. Their methods had been carefully designed to avoid triggering the school's anti-bullying protocols, while maximizing psychological damage to their targets. But Emma's investigation had also revealed that Tyler, Madison, and Derek were not operating independently. Their harassment campaigns had been supported by a network of students who participated in sharing, amplifying, and validating content that systematically destroyed other students' reputations and social standing. Emma had identified patterns of coordinated behavior that suggested a level of organization and planning that elevated their activities from typical teenage cruelty to systematic persecution. Detective Santos arrived at Riverside High School at 9:15 a.m., accompanied by two cybercrime specialists who had reviewed Emma's documentation and determined that multiple criminal statutes had potentially been violated. The evidence Emma had compiled included documentation of identity theft, fraudulent social media manipulation, criminal harassment, and cyberstalking, activities that carried serious legal consequences for adult perpetrators and could result in juvenile charges that would affect college admissions and future employment opportunities. The investigation that followed moved with unprecedented speed and thoroughness. Emma's documentation had been so comprehensive and professionally prepared that law enforcement officers were able to immediately verify her claims and expand their investigation based on her analysis. Within hours, Tyler, Madison, and Derek were called out of their classes for interviews with police officers and school administrators, who had finally understood the scope of their systematic harassment campaigns. Tyler's confidence evaporated when he was confronted with evidence of his artificial social media manipulation, financial misrepresentation, and participation in coordinated harassment campaigns that had contributed to other students' psychological trauma. The charismatic athlete who had dominated Riverside's social hierarchy found himself unable to explain away documentation that revealed the calculated nature of his cruelty and the sophisticated methods he had used to avoid accountability. Madison's carefully constructed online persona crumbled when investigators revealed the extent of her family's financial deception, her use of counterfeit merchandise to maintain false appearances, and her systematic manipulation of social media algorithms to amplify harassment content. The influencer who had built her reputation on authenticity and relatability was exposed as a fraud who had been manufacturing her entire online identity. Derek's role as a willing participant in systematic harassment became undeniable when investigators presented evidence of his coordination with Tyler and Madison, his use of family resources to fund harassment campaigns, and his participation in activities that had contributed to other students requiring medical intervention for anxiety, depression, and self-harm incidents. But the most shocking revelation came when Emma herself appeared in Principal Anderson's office at 11:30 a.m., accompanied by her mother and two representatives from the Regional Technology Initiative that had been funding Emma's advanced training and research activities. Emma was not just a high school student with exceptional technical skills. She was a professional consultant whose expertise had been utilized by law enforcement agencies, educational institutions, and technology companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. Emma's work with the Regional Technology Initiative had focused specifically on identifying and documenting cyberbullying networks that operated in educational environments. Her placement at Riverside High School had been part of a larger research project designed to understand how harassment campaigns developed and spread through social media platforms in small community settings. Emma's documentation of Tyler, Madison, and Derek's activities was not just evidence of personal harassment. It was professional research that would be used to develop better detection and prevention strategies for educational institutions throughout the region. The quiet, invisible student that Tyler, Madison, and Derek had targeted for harassment was actually an undercover researcher whose technical capabilities far exceeded anything available to typical high school administrators. Emma had been documenting not just their harassment of her, but their entire network of activities, building a comprehensive case study that would be used to train law enforcement officers, school administrators, and mental health professionals in recognizing and responding to sophisticated cyberbullying campaigns. Emma's revelation transformed the entire narrative surrounding the previous evening's confrontation at the bus stop. Tyler, Madison, and Derek had not been offering help to a vulnerable classmate. They had been attempting to manipulate and humiliate a professional investigator whose technical skills and analytical capabilities had been systematically documenting their criminal activities for months. The impact on Riverside High School's student body was immediate and profound. Students who had viewed Emma as antisocial and ungrateful suddenly understood that her careful observation and strategic withdrawal had been professional behavior, not personal weakness. Emma's refusal to engage with Tyler, Madison, and Derek's harassment had not been evidence of arrogance or instability. It had been the measured response of someone who was building a legal case that would hold them accountable for their systematic cruelty. Emma's mother, Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, revealed that their move to Cedar Falls had been motivated by Emma's selection for the Regional Technology Initiative, not by financial necessity or professional opportunity. Sarah's position at Cedar Falls General Hospital had been arranged to provide family stability while Emma completed her research assignment, which was expected to result in published academic papers and policy recommendations that would influence how educational institutions addressed cyberbullying throughout the United States. The students who had speculated about Emma's family's financial situation discovered that Dr. Rodriguez was not struggling economically, but was one of the most highly compensated medical professionals in the region. with additional income from her consultation work with trauma response organizations. Emma's modest clothing and lifestyle choices had not been evidence of poverty, but had been deliberate decisions designed to maintain her research cover and avoid attracting attention that might compromise her investigation. Emma's academic record at Riverside, which had always been exemplary, was revealed to be just one aspect of her professional portfolio. She had been simultaneously enrolled in graduate-level courses through Portland State University, had published research papers in peer-reviewed journals, and had been accepted to multiple doctoral programs that would begin immediately after her high school graduation. Emma's high school experience had been a temporary assignment, not a permanent life situation. The revelation of Emma's true identity sent ripples of panic through the network of students who had participated in or supported Tyler, Madison, and Derek's harassment campaigns. Students who had shared, liked, or commented on content designed to humiliate other classmates suddenly realized that their participation had been documented by a professional investigator whose evidence could support criminal charges in civil litigation. Emma's comprehensive documentation included not just the primary harassers, but also the secondary participants who had amplified their content, the bystanders who had failed to report obvious harassment, and the school personnel who had ignored or minimized reports of systematic bullying. Her research had revealed that harassment campaigns succeeded not just because of active perpetrators, but because of passive enablers who created environments where cruelty could flourish without consequences. By noon on Thursday, the story of Emma Rodriguez's true identity had spread throughout Cedar Falls and was beginning to attract regional and national media attention. Local news stations were reporting on the high school student who had exposed a sophisticated cyberbullying network while conducting professional research for a major technology initiative. Social media platforms were buzzing with discussions about the implications of Emma's investigation and the systematic harassment that she had documented. Tyler, Madison, and Derek found themselves at the center of a media storm that exposed not just their harassment of Emma, but their systematic targeting of vulnerable students over multiple years. Their artificial social media popularity evaporated as their manufactured engagement was revealed. Their carefully constructed personas crumbled under investigation, and their future prospects were jeopardized by criminal charges and civil lawsuits that could follow them for years. The broader impact of Emma's revelation extended far beyond individual consequences for the primary harassers. Riverside High School was forced to acknowledge that their anti-bullying policies had been inadequate to address sophisticated harassment campaigns that operated primarily through social media platforms. The school district faced federal investigation, potential litigation from affected families, and mandatory policy changes that would fundamentally alter how they address student conflicts and online behavior. Emma's research had demonstrated that cyberbullying in educational environments was far more organized, persistent, and damaging than most adults realized. Her documentation provided concrete evidence that systematic harassment campaigns could contribute to serious mental health crises, academic failure, and long-term psychological trauma that required professional intervention. Emma's work would influence policy decisions, training programs, and legislative initiatives designed to protect students from sophisticated forms of digital persecution. But perhaps the most significant impact of Emma's revelation was the transformation it created in how Riverside High School students understood power, influence, and social dynamics. The quiet, invisible girl who had been dismissed as antisocial and irrelevant had demonstrated that true power came from knowledge, preparation, and strategic thinking rather than artificial popularity or manufactured social media presence. Emma's calm response to months of harassment, her strategic documentation of evidence, and her professional approach to seeking accountability had achieved more meaningful results than any dramatic confrontation or emotional retaliation could have accomplished. She had proven that systematic problems required systematic solutions, and that individual courage combined with professional capabilities could create lasting change that protected not just herself, but future students who might become targets of similar harassment campaigns. In the weeks that followed Emma's revelation, Riverside High School implemented comprehensive policy changes designed to prevent the kind of systematic harassment that Tyler, Madison, and Derek had perpetrated. Students received mandatory training in digital citizenship, social media responsibility, and bystander intervention. School administrators were required to complete advanced training in recognizing and responding to cyberbullying campaigns that operated across multiple platforms and involved coordinated harassment activities. Emma completed her research assignment and graduated from Riverside High School with recognition as the student whose work had created the most significant positive impact on school, culture, and student safety in the institution's history. Her research was published in multiple academic journals, influenced state and federal policy discussions, and provided a model for how educational institutions could identify and address sophisticated harassment campaigns that traditional anti-bullying approaches had failed to detect. Tyler, Madison, and Derek faced legal consequences that reflected the serious nature of their systematic harassment activities. Their college applications were affected by their criminal charges. Their social media influence disappeared when their artificial engagement was exposed, and their reputations in Cedar Falls never recovered from the revelation of their calculated cruelty and manufactured personas. Emma Rodriguez proved that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one who appears to have no power at all, and that systematic harassment campaigns are no match for systematic investigation, professional documentation, and strategic accountability. Her story became a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that quiet observation can be more powerful than loud confrontation, and that true strength often comes from knowledge, preparation, and the courage to use both effectively. The girl who had been forced to walk home in the rain had transformed an entire school district's approach to student safety, and everyone who had underestimated her learned that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous opponents of all. 6 months after Emma Rodriguez's revelation transformed Riverside High School, the changes had become so deeply embedded in the school's culture that incoming students couldn't imagine the toxic environment that had existed before. The hallways that once buzzed with whispered cruelty and manufactured drama now hummed with genuine collaboration and authentic connection. Students who had once lived in fear of becoming the next target of systematic harassment were now empowered with tools, resources, and institutional support that made such campaigns impossible to sustain. Emma walked through those same hallways on a crisp October morning, but her experience bore no resemblance to the careful navigation she had practiced for 2 years. Students greeted her with genuine respect. Teachers consulted her on technology initiatives, and administrators sought her input on policy decisions that would affect future generations of Riverside students. Emma had evolved from an invisible observer to a recognized leader whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of her high school experience. The transformation hadn't been immediate or effortless. The weeks following Emma's revelation had been turbulent as the school community grappled with the reality of what had been happening beneath the surface of their daily interactions. Students who had participated in or enabled harassment campaigns faced accountability measures that ranged from mandatory counseling to academic consequences. Parents struggled to understand how their children had become involved in sophisticated cruelty that had contributed to other students' psychological trauma. But Emma had approached the aftermath of her investigation with the same methodical precision that had characterized her original research. Rather than simply exposing problems and leaving others to develop solutions, Emma had partnered with school administrators, mental health professionals, and technology experts to design comprehensive interventions that addressed both immediate damage and long-term prevention. Emma's first initiative focused on the students who had been targets of Tyler, Madison, and Derek's harassment campaigns. Working with Dr. Amanda Chen, a clinical psychologist who specialized in adolescent trauma, Emma had developed a support program that provided affected students with counseling resources, academic accommodations, and peer mentorship opportunities designed to rebuild confidence and social connections that had been systematically destroyed. The program was revolutionary in its approach to addressing cyberbullying trauma. Rather than treating affected students as victims who needed protection, Emma's model empowered them as survivors who possessed valuable insights that could prevent future harassment campaigns. Students who had been isolated and humiliated became advocates and educators, sharing their experiences in ways that helped their peers understand the real-world impact of online cruelty. Marcus Thompson, a sophomore who had transferred to another school after being targeted by Madison's harassment campaign, returned to Riverside as one of the first participants in Emma's program. Marcus had lost 40 pounds, developed severe anxiety, and required hospitalization for depression after months of systematic humiliation that had convinced him he was worthless and unwanted. 6 months later, Marcus was serving as a peer counselor who helped other students recognize early warning signs of harassment campaigns and develop healthy coping strategies. Sarah Kim, Derek's younger sister who had been living in constant fear that her brother's targets would retaliate against her, discovered through Emma's program that her anxiety and social withdrawal were symptoms of secondary trauma that could be addressed through therapeutic intervention. Sarah became an advocate for siblings and family members of harassment perpetrators, helping them understand that they were not responsible for their relatives' choices, while providing support for the complex emotions they experienced. Jennifer Martinez, a senior who had attempted suicide after a coordinated harassment campaign, convinced her entire friend group to exclude and humiliate her, returned to school with a renewed sense of purpose and self-worth. Jennifer's recovery had been supported by Emma's program, but more importantly, Jennifer had become a powerful speaker who educated other students about the connection between online harassment and mental health crises. Emma's second major initiative focused on transforming the social media landscape that had enabled systematic harassment to flourish undetected. Working with technology companies, law enforcement agencies, and digital citizenship organizations, Emma had developed educational programs that taught students to recognize artificial engagement, identify coordinated harassment campaigns, and understand the legal and ethical implications of their online behavior. The program included hands-on training in digital forensics that showed students how their online activities created permanent records that could be analyzed and presented as evidence in legal proceedings. Students learned to examine social media content with the same critical thinking skills they applied to academic research, questioning sources, verifying information, and understanding the difference between authentic engagement and manufactured popularity. Emma's digital citizenship curriculum had been adopted by school districts throughout Oregon and was being piloted in educational systems across the United States. Her approach combined technical education with ethical development, helping students understand that online spaces were not separate from real-world consequences, but were integral parts of their personal and professional development. The most innovative aspect of Emma's program was its emphasis on empowering bystanders to become active participants in preventing harassment rather than passive observers of cruelty. Emma had demonstrated through her research that harassment campaigns succeeded primarily because they created environments where witnesses felt powerless to intervene effectively. Her bystander intervention training provided students with concrete tools and strategies for disrupting harassment campaigns without putting themselves at risk. Students learned to document harassment activities using the same forensic techniques that Emma had employed in her investigation. They practiced reporting procedures that ensured their concerns would be taken seriously by administrators who had been trained to recognize sophisticated harassment patterns. Most importantly, they developed confidence in their ability to support targeted students in ways that strengthened rather than inadvertently undermined their resilience. Emma's third initiative addressed the institutional changes necessary to prevent systematic harassment from taking root in educational environments. Working with Principal Anderson and the district's legal team, Emma had developed administrative protocols that required schools to treat cyberbullying as a serious crime rather than typical teenage drama. The new protocols included mandatory reporting procedures for harassment that crossed legal thresholds, partnership agreements with law enforcement agencies that specialized in cybercrime, and training programs for educators that helped them recognize early warning signs of systematic campaigns. School administrators were no longer able to dismiss reports of online harassment as interpersonal conflicts that students should resolve independently. Emma's administrative reforms had attracted attention from federal education officials who were developing national guidelines for addressing cyberbullying in educational environments. Her work had influenced congressional hearings on technology and student safety, and her recommendations were being incorporated into federal funding requirements for educational technology initiatives. The personal consequences for Tyler, Madison, and Derek had been severe, but had also created opportunities for redemption that reflected Emma's commitment to restorative rather than purely punitive justice. Tyler had been required to complete extensive community service focused on supporting students with learning disabilities, a population he had previously targeted for harassment. His work with these students had challenged his assumptions about strength, intelligence, and social value in ways that transformed his understanding of leadership and influence. Tyler's college basketball scholarship had been withdrawn when his artificial social media presence was exposed, but he had used the experience as motivation to develop authentic relationships and genuine skills rather than relying on manufactured popularity. Tyler was now attending community college and working toward a degree in social work, with plans to specialize in preventing adolescent violence and harassment. Madison had been required to delete all her social media accounts and complete a year-long digital detox that forced her to develop identity and self-worth independent of online validation. Her family's financial deceptions had been exposed through Emma's investigation, but Madison had used the experience to develop authenticity and transparency that she had never possessed during her years of manufactured influence. Madison was now working with a nonprofit organization that educated young people about the psychological dangers of social media manipulation and artificial engagement. Her presentations to middle school students included honest discussions of how she had constructed false personas and the emotional emptiness that had resulted from seeking validation through manufactured popularity. Derek had been required to liquidate his collection of expensive possessions and donate the proceeds to mental health organizations that supported students affected by cyberbullying. His parents' divorce had been finalized with agreements that prioritized Derek's therapeutic treatment and educational development over maintaining appearances or protecting family reputation. Derek was attending a therapeutic boarding school that specialized in helping adolescents develop empathy, emotional regulation, and healthy relationship skills. His progress had been remarkable, and he was planning to return to Cedar Falls for his senior year with a commitment to using his family's resources to support rather than harm other students. Emma's approach to accountability had emphasized learning and growth rather than punishment and exclusion. She understood that harassment perpetrators were often struggling with their own insecurities, family dysfunction, and social pressures that had distorted their understanding of power and influence. Emma's interventions had created pathways for redemption that benefited not just the perpetrators, but the broader community that would be affected by their future choices. The ripple effects of Emma's work extended far beyond Riverside High School and had begun influencing How educational institutions throughout the region address student conflicts and social media behavior. Emma had been invited to present her research at academic conferences, policy summits, and professional development workshops that brought together educators, law enforcement officials, mental health professionals, and technology experts. Emma's presentations were unlike typical academic research in their combination of rigorous methodology and passionate advocacy. She spoke with the authority of someone who had experienced systematic harassment firsthand, but also with the expertise of a professional investigator who understood the technical and legal complexities of cyberbullying campaigns. Her audience is left with both emotional understanding of harassment's impact and practical tools for preventing and responding to sophisticated cruelty. University admissions officers had taken notice of Emma's unique combination of technical expertise, research accomplishments, and social impact. Emma had received full scholarship offers from multiple institutions, including invitations to participate in accelerated doctoral programs that would allow her to continue her research while pursuing advanced degrees in computer science, digital forensics, and educational policy. Emma had chosen to attend Stanford University's combined computer science and law program, with plans to specialize in technology policy and civil rights enforcement. Her long-term goal was to develop federal legislation that would provide educational institutions with resources and requirements necessary to protect students from sophisticated forms of digital harassment. But Emma's most significant achievement was the transformation she had created in how her peers understood power, influence, and social responsibility. Students at Riverside High School now recognized that true strength came from using capabilities to protect rather than harm others, that authentic popularity was based on character rather than manufactured engagement, and that individual courage could create systemic change when combined with strategic thinking and professional competence. Emma's story had become a case study taught in schools throughout the Pacific Northwest, demonstrating how systematic problems required systematic solutions and how individual students could become powerful advocates for institutional change. Her example had inspired other students to develop their own investigations into social injustice, environmental degradation, and educational inequality. The quiet girl who had been forced to walk home in the rain had proven that silence could be strategy, that observation could be preparation, and that the most dangerous opponents are often those who appear to have no power at all. Emma Rodriguez had transformed not just her own high school experience, but had created a model for how young people could use their unique capabilities to address systematic problems that adults had failed to recognize or resolve. As Emma prepared to graduate from Riverside High School and begin her university studies, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible observer to recognized leader. The harassment she had endured had been painful and isolating, but it had also provided her with insights and motivation that would influence her entire career. Emma understood that her experience had been simultaneously personal trauma and professional opportunity, and she was committed to ensuring that her suffering would prevent other students from experiencing similar systematic cruelty. Emma's final presentation to the Riverside High School community was a masterpiece of reflection and inspiration that brought together all the lessons she had learned through her investigation and advocacy work. She spoke about the importance of protecting vulnerable community members, the power of authentic connection over artificial popularity, and the responsibility that came with technical capabilities and social influence. Emma's speech concluded with a challenge that resonated throughout the Cedar Falls community and beyond. She reminded her audience that every person possessed unique capabilities that could be used to create positive change, but that those capabilities came with obligations to use them ethically and effectively. Emma's example had demonstrated that individual courage combined with systematic thinking could transform institutions, but she emphasized that such transformation required ongoing commitment rather than single dramatic gestures. The girl who had started as an invisible target of systematic harassment, had become a nationally recognized advocate whose work would influence policy decisions, educational practices, and technology development for years to come. Emma Rodriguez had proven that the most powerful response to cruelty was not revenge but redemption, not retaliation but transformation, and not anger but the strategic application of knowledge, compassion, and unwavering commitment to justice. Emma's legacy at Riverside High School was not just the policy she had created or the program she had established, but the fundamental shift in how students understood their responsibilities to each other and their capabilities to create positive change. She had demonstrated that systematic problems could be solved by systematic solutions, that individual students could become powerful advocates for institutional reform, and that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous opponents of injustice and the most effective champions of transformation. 3 years later, Emma Rodriguez stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Educational Technology and Student Safety, delivering the keynote address that would cement her reputation as one of the most influential advocates for digital rights in American education. The audience of educators, policymakers, technology executives, and student advocates listened with rapt attention as Emma described the transformation that had begun with a simple decision to walk home in the rain rather than accept help from students who had been systematically tormenting her. The Emma who addressed the conference bore little resemblance to the quiet, invisible student who had once navigated Riverside High School's hallways like a ghost. At 20 years old, Emma carried herself with the confident authority of someone who had learned to wield power responsibly and effectively. Her voice, once carefully modulated to avoid attracting attention, now commanded respect from audiences who recognized her as a leading expert in cyberbullying prevention and digital citizenship education. Emma's presentation included data that would have been impossible to imagine 3 years earlier. The intervention program she had developed at Riverside High School had been implemented in over 400 educational institutions across 12 states, resulting in a documented 73% reduction in reported cyberbullying incidents and an 85% improvement in students' willingness to report harassment they witnessed or experienced. The digital forensics techniques that Emma had pioneered for documenting harassment campaigns had been adopted by law enforcement agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest and were being taught in police academies as standard investigation procedures. Emma's methodology had contributed to the successful prosecution of over 200 cyberbullying cases, including several that had resulted in federal charges under civil rights statutes. But perhaps more importantly, Emma's work had fundamentally altered how young people understood their relationship with technology and their responsibilities to each other in digital spaces. The generation of students who had learned digital citizenship through Emma's curricula approached social media with a sophistication and ethical awareness that their predecessors had never possessed. Emma's research had proven that cyberbullying was not an inevitable consequence of teenage social dynamics, but was a learned behavior that could be prevented through education, early intervention, and institutional accountability. Her work had challenged assumptions about adolescent development, technology use, and the role of educational institutions in preparing students for digital citizenship. The personal cost of Emma's advocacy work had been significant, but had also created opportunities for growth and connection that she could never have anticipated. Emma's decision to reveal her technical capabilities and professional credentials had initially felt like a loss of the privacy and anonymity that had protected her for years. But as Emma had become a public figure whose story inspired other young advocates, she had discovered that visibility could be a source of strength rather than vulnerability, when it was accompanied by authentic purpose and genuine expertise. Emma's relationship with her mother had deepened as they had worked together to navigate the challenges and opportunities that came with Emma's sudden prominence. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez had initially worried that her Daughter's advocacy work would interfere with her academic development and future opportunities, but she had come to understand that Emma's unique combination of technical skills, research capabilities, and personal experience created possibilities that traditional educational pathways could never provide. Sarah had become an advocate in her own right, using her medical expertise to document the health consequences of systematic harassment and speaking at conferences about the intersection of cyberbullying and adolescent mental health. The mother-daughter team had co-authored research papers that influenced medical training programs and helped healthcare providers recognize the symptoms of digital harassment trauma. Emma's work at Stanford University had exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of her professors and advisors. She had completed her undergraduate coursework in computer science and pre-law in just 2 years, while simultaneously pursuing graduate-level research in digital forensics and technology policy. Emma's thesis research focused on developing artificial intelligence systems that could detect coordinated harassment campaigns in real time, potentially preventing the kind of systematic targeting that she had experienced and documented. The technology Emma was developing combined machine learning algorithms with psychological research to identify patterns of behavior that indicated organized harassment rather than typical social media conflict. Her system could analyze language patterns, engagement metrics, and network behaviors to flag potential campaigns before they reached the threshold of causing serious psychological harm to their targets. Major technology companies had expressed interest in licensing Emma's detection algorithms, but Emma had insisted that any commercial applications include mandatory reporting features that would alert law enforcement agencies when criminal harassment was detected. Emma's commitment to using technology for protection rather than profit had attracted attention from venture capital firms that specialized in social impact investing. Emma's influence extended beyond academic research and technology development. She had been appointed to the Federal Advisory Committee on Digital Citizenship Education, where she worked with policymakers to develop national standards for teaching responsible technology use in educational settings. Emma's recommendations had influenced federal funding requirements for educational technology programs and had established cyberbullying prevention as a mandatory component of digital literacy curricula. Emma's advocacy had also created a network of young people who had been inspired by her example to pursue their own investigations into systematic injustice and institutional accountability. Students throughout the United States were using Emma's research methodology to document discrimination, harassment, and abuse in their own educational environments, creating a generation of advocates who combined technical competence with social consciousness. The Riverside High School that Emma had graduated from 3 years earlier bore little resemblance to the institution where she had been forced to walk home in the rain. The school had become a model for cyberbullying prevention and digital citizenship. Education, hosting delegations of educators and policymakers who wanted to understand how systematic institutional change could be achieved through student-led advocacy. Principal Anderson, who had initially struggled to understand the scope of the problems Emma had uncovered, had become one of the most respected administrators in the state for his willingness to implement comprehensive reforms and his commitment to maintaining the programs Emma had established. Anderson frequently spoke at educational conferences about the importance of listening to student voices and taking seriously the insights that young people could provide about their own educational experiences. Tyler Brooks had completed his community college education and had been accepted to a 4-year university, where he was studying social work with a specialization in adolescent counseling. His experience with Emma's accountability process had fundamentally altered his understanding of leadership and influence, and he had become an advocate for restorative justice approaches to addressing harmful behavior in educational settings. Tyler's transformation had been genuine and sustained, supported by ongoing therapy and mentorship that had helped him develop empathy and emotional regulation skills that he had never possessed during his years as a popular athlete. Tyler's story had become part of Emma's presentations about the possibility of redemption and growth, even for students who had engaged in systematic harassment. Madison Clark had completed her digital detox program and had enrolled in a communications program that focused on ethical journalism and authentic storytelling. Her experience with manufactured online personas had given her unique insights into the psychology of social media manipulation, and she was working on a documentary project about the mental health consequences of seeking validation through artificial engagement. Madison's artistic work combined her technical understanding of social media algorithms with her personal experience of the emotional emptiness that resulted from building identity around fabricated popularity. Her photography and video installations had been featured in galleries that focused on technology's impact on human connection and authentic self-expression. Derek Kim had successfully completed his therapeutic education program and had returned to Cedar Falls for his senior year of high school, where he had become a peer counselor specializing in helping students from wealthy families who struggled with pressure to maintain appearances and social status. Derek's experience with his parents' divorce and his own participation in harassment campaigns had given him empathy for students who used cruelty as a way of managing their own insecurities and family dysfunction. Derek's transformation had included extensive volunteer work with organizations that supported students experiencing family trauma, and he had been accepted to college programs that would allow him to pursue degrees in psychology and family therapy. Derek's story demonstrated that students from privileged backgrounds could also be victims of systematic pressures that distorted their understanding of healthy relationships and appropriate behavior. The broader impact of Emma's work had extended far beyond individual transformations and institutional reforms. Emma's research had contributed to legislative initiatives that established cyberbullying as a distinct category of criminal behavior with specific penalties and reporting requirements. Her advocacy had influenced federal civil rights enforcement priorities and had resulted in increased funding for programs that supported students affected by digital harassment. Emma's work had also attracted international attention from educators and policymakers who were grappling with similar challenges in their own educational systems. Emma had been invited to speak at conferences in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, where her research methodology and intervention strategies were being adapted for different cultural contexts and legal frameworks. The United Nations had invited Emma to participate in a working group focused on developing international standards for protecting young people from digital harassment and ensuring that educational institutions maintained safe learning environments. Regardless of students' access to technology or social media platforms, Emma's influence on her generation of digital natives had been profound and lasting. Students who had learned about digital citizenship through Emma's curricula approached online spaces with a level of critical thinking and ethical awareness that distinguished them from their predecessors. They understood that their online behavior had real-world consequences, that their digital choices reflected their character and values, and that they had responsibilities to protect vulnerable community members from harassment and abuse. Emma's work had proven that systematic problems required systematic solutions, but that systematic solutions could be developed and implemented by individuals who combined technical competence with ethical commitment and strategic thinking. Emma's example had inspired a generation of young advocates who understood that they possessed the capabilities to identify injustice, document abuse, and create institutional change when they applied their skills with purpose and persistence. The quiet girl who had been forced to walk home in the rain had become a national voice for digital rights and educational reform. But Emma's most significant achievement was the transformation she had created in how young people understood their own power and their obligations to each other. Emma had demonstrated that true influence came from using capabilities to protect rather than harm others, That authentic leadership required courage to challenge systems rather than comfort with existing hierarchies, and that individual action could create lasting change when it was grounded in expertise, ethics, and unwavering commitment to justice. Emma's story had become more than an inspirational narrative about overcoming harassment. It had become a blueprint for how any student could transform their educational environment and create positive change that extended far beyond their immediate community. Emma had proven that the most dangerous opponents of systematic injustice are often those who appear to have no power at all, and that the most effective advocates for institutional reform are frequently those who have experienced the system's failures most directly and personally. As Emma concluded her keynote address to the packed auditorium, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible target to recognized leader. The harassment she had endured had been painful and isolating, but it had also provided her with insights and motivation that would influence her entire career and the lives of countless students who would benefit from the programs and policies she had created. Emma's final words to the audience captured the essence of everything she had learned through her experience: that systematic change required individual courage, that technical capabilities came with ethical responsibilities, and that the most powerful response to cruelty was not revenge but the strategic application of knowledge and compassion to create institutions that protected rather than harmed the most vulnerable members of their communities. The girl who had chosen dignity over convenience, principle over popularity, and justice over revenge had become a force for transformation whose influence would extend far beyond her own lifetime, inspiring generations of young advocates to use their unique capabilities to create a world where systematic harassment was not just punished but prevented, and where every student could pursue their education in safety, dignity, and authentic connection with their community. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.